We come before you just full of wonder and excitement at knowing who you are and being in relationship with you. You are our creator and you have made everything seen and unseen, and it is to your glory that we are a part of that creation, that you have made us in your image, and beyond that, even knowing that we would sin and fall, you have redeemed us because of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so you are worthy of all praise and honor and power. You are compassionate and gracious. You are slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness. And we are the recipients of that. So we have much to be thankful for this evening. I thank you that you have blessed Jeffrey with a mind that thinks deeply and that understands clearly and then communicates that to his students. And I pray that you would bless him tonight as he leads us in this lecture, that you would open our minds and our hearts to know and understand the truth, and that you would give us courage and boldness to go out and speak the truth in whatever situation we find ourselves in. So we thank you that you have allowed us to meet together tonight and look forward to what you will teach us through Jeffrey. It's in your name that we pray, Lord Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And nice to be with you all this evening. Hope you've had a productive week so far. If you just logged in, we do have an Areopagus Forum scheduled for tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. You should have gotten an email from the Areopagus to that effect, featuring Dr. John West. This is someone that I'm sure you would very much enjoy hearing and benefit from what he has to share on Darwin's 3 big ideas that basically have contributed to the corruption of Western civilization. So join us if your schedule allows. Now, last week we started into part 5 of your outline notes, the historical quest for the real Jesus. And just to reiterate a couple of points that we made as we were closing things out last week, and then we'll continue on in that outline. But if you'll look there on page 32 of your outline, that quote by Craig Blomberg. Now, Craig Blomberg is a very highly respected Christian philosopher, theologian, New Testament scholar at Denver Theological Seminary. Denver Seminary is one of the leading evangelical seminaries in America. And if you see the quote there by Craig Blomberg, I thought this was a good way to start our session this morning or this evening. And he is talking about the strong evidence that is put forth in the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament in support of the traditional understanding of the historical Jesus. And you see his argument there, quote, when sources repeatedly prove trustworthy in cases where they can be verified, those sources then should be given the benefit of the doubt where they cannot be verified. Think about it in terms of a friend who's very reliable, very trustworthy, very honest. And even if that friend were to say something that sounds somewhat questionable, you would tend to give that person the benefit of the doubt because they've earned your respect. And that's essentially the point that he's trying to make here about the gospel and the rest of the New Testament accounts. And you recall that this section, part 5, began by sort of comparing and contrasting what we know about the historical Socrates to the historical Jesus. And Luke Timothy Johnson makes some very interesting comments about that. With the historical Socrates, the written accounts that we have conflict to some extent. In fact, one of those 3 sources depicted Socrates, the historical Socrates, as frankly kind of a crank and a crackpot. Another was much more respectful. And then you have Plato's account of Socrates, which is really the portrayal of Socrates that has been passed down for the most part through the centuries. And Plato considered Socrates not only to be perhaps the wisest man in Greece at the time, but also a prophet of sorts. So contrast that with with the characterizations of Jesus that we encounter in the Gospels and the New Testament. And those are totally in sync when it comes to the character and the nature and, frankly, the narrative story of the historical Jesus, as opposed to the varying accounts of the historical Socrates. So again, Craig Blomberg is reminding us when sources repeatedly prove themselves to be trustworthy, they should be given the benefit of the doubt in cases where they cannot necessarily be verified. This is what is known, he says, as placing the burden of proof on the skeptics when it comes to, for instance, the historicity of the Gospels. And he quotes there, or he alludes to Søren Kierkegaard, who was a Christian philosopher in the 19th century. And Kierkegaard approached the Christian faith and scripture from a somewhat skeptical position. Kierkegaard is oftentimes referred to as the father of Christian existentialism. Now, by the way, Christian existentialism is not anywhere close to secular existentialism, but nonetheless, Kierkegaard believed that the Christian faith really involves a leap of faith, that we don't operate so much on the basis of historical evidence as in just entrusting ourselves to the God who seemingly is revealed in Scripture. But Craig Blomberg will take exception to Kierkegaard's analogy there of the leap of faith, because Kierkegaard, in some respects, even implies that Christian faith might even border on perhaps even an absurd leap of faith. And Blomberg, as I said, takes exception to that. And continuing on with the quote here, Blomberg writes that rather than that absurd leap of faith that Kierkegaard wrote about, one may liken our situation more to that of a long jumper or a broad jumper who runs as far as she can down the track on solid ground, but ultimately must leap into the pit beyond the track. And he goes on to say, historical evidence moves us a long way toward demonstrating our belief. And as a result, the faith that is necessary to fill in the remaining gap is reasonable. It's not an absurd leap of faith. It's a reasonable step of faith. So I wanted to begin with that point. He goes on to say that a proper historiography must allow for the miraculous as a possible explanation for events that cannot be plausibly explained otherwise. The only way to avoid this conclusion is to begin with an anti-supernaturalist bias or an atheistic bias. But if there is a God similar to the one that's revealed to us in Scripture, then it's eminently reasonable that at times of his own choosing, that God should choose to intervene in the time-space universe and generate events not otherwise attributable to natural processes. So as we said last week, if the first verse of the Bible, if Genesis 1:1 is in fact true, then there's nothing else that we can encounter in the rest of the Bible that's problematic, including even spectacular miracles, even including the resurrection of Jesus Christ himself. Now, one other point on the following page, page 33, under what really matters, and this is actually what we ended on last week, Luke Timothy Johnson writes this in his book, The Real Jesus. When the witness of the New Testament is taken as a whole, a deep consistency can be detected beneath its surface diversity. And there is some diversity in terms of the four Gospels and their presentation of some of the details in the life of Christ. But as he says, taken as a whole, there is a deep consistency that needs to be acknowledged and needs to be appreciated. Now, with that, we go to the extra biblical sources, Christian sources, and then we'll look at non-Christian sources that relate to the historical Jesus that date back to the 1st century or two. And in terms of other New Testament sources, we have, as you see there, the testimony of the church fathers, and then some other Christian sources as well. But let's start with other New Testament sources before we look at the church fathers. Now, in particular, the Apostle Paul, who writes a good portion, as you know, of the New Testament, what does Paul have to say about Christ? Well, outside the four Gospels, we can actually learn quite a lot about the life and ministry of Jesus through Paul's epistles. In fact, some, if not all, of his epistles probably predate the Gospels and the writing of the book of Acts. So he's actually writing before, at least perhaps, some of the four Gospels were actually written. But in his epistles, Paul, of course, does not provide a full narrative about Jesus, but he often refers to the story of Jesus as if his readers are very familiar with the details. And that's an important point to keep in mind. See, this assumes that the basic story of Jesus was well known by the time Paul began writing his letters to the churches, beginning about the year 50 AD, so only about 20 years after Jesus's ministry here on earth. So it's reasonable to assume that the reason that Paul doesn't go into a lot of the details of the life of Christ is because for Christians by the mid-century, those details were pretty well known. So anyway, skeptics, of course, will oftentimes not take Paul's writing seriously. Remember, we've talked several times in this course about how that skeptical scholars today will argue that Paul kind of reinterpreted and reinvented Jesus, and Paul was the inventor of Christianity. But of course, that really does not hold up in any way to historical scrutiny. Now, skeptics also refuse to give any credence to the testimony of Jesus that's found in the epistles of James or Peter or the book of Hebrews as well. And again, this is particularly ironic, I think, in the case of James, since the book of James might have been one of the earliest New Testament compositions. Some Bible scholars believe that probably the book of James was the first New Testament book written. Nobody can be certain, but we do know that it was written long before the year 62 or 63 because James was martyred in that year. I believe it was 62 actually when James was martyred. So he would have written his epistle sometime prior to that. And of course, according to our earliest sources, James was the half-brother of Jesus. Now, throughout the New Testament, there are constant confirmations of the gospel accounts of Jesus's life. For instance, Jesus was a Jew. He was a Jew of the tribe of Judah, and he was a descendant of David. Well, Paul writes about that. So does the author of the epistle to the Hebrews. We also learn that Jesus was a rabbi, a very gifted teacher. Well, Paul refers to that, as does James in his epistle. Jesus suffers under Pontius Pilate. Paul comments on that, as does the epistle to the Hebrews, as does the epistle of 1 Peter. Jesus was crucified. Paul refers to it, so does Hebrews, so does 1 Peter. Jesus was buried. Paul refers to that. And furthermore, Jesus was resurrected and appeared to witnesses after his death. Paul elaborates on that as well. So these confirmations really indicate that the basic story of Jesus's life was widely known by the mid-first century, which means that the corresponding points in the Gospels were probably not the invention of any single author or group. And that's another important point to keep in mind, that there isn't one person who came up with this story, this narrative of Jesus, but that was a narrative that was well known among the Christian churches at the time, and apparently had spread pretty widely by the middle of the first century. Now, Luke Timothy Johnson concludes this section by making the comment in his book, when the witness of the New Testament is taken as a whole, a deep consistency can be detected beneath its surface diversity. Why is there surface level diversity? Well, because it's written by several different people, and they are they are writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, but they're also separate people. So there is some surface level diversity, but other than that, there's a deep consistency that can be detected. Now, with that, let's move on in your outline to the extra biblical Christian sources. What can we learn from sources outside the Bible? And first of all, let's look at the witness of the church fathers. Now, the writings of the church fathers include additional commentary on the life of Jesus, but frankly, they don't really contribute that much. Now, the church fathers were leading scholars, clerics. Many of them were leaders in particular churches. Some of these church fathers were philosophers. 3 or 4 of them were very effective Christian apologists. In other words, defenders of the Christian faith, using philosophy and logic and history and so on. And so we have, for instance, writings such as First Clement. This is a book that was written by Clement of Rome. It's normally dated to about the year 95. So this was actually a book that was written before the end of the first century. And it's very likely that Clement of Rome probably knew at least some of the apostles, the first generation apostles. We also have epistles of Ignatius early in the 2nd century. We have a work called the Didache, which some scholars believe at least part of the Didache was probably written in the 1st century and finished probably in the 2nd century. There's also other books, some of which you might have heard of, like the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas. No, by the way, the Epistle of Barnabas was written in the 2nd century. Nobody ever thought that it was written by the historical Barnabas. But nonetheless, a book that was highly regarded. And then you have writings by the philosopher Justin Martyr, and again, church leaders like Irenaeus and Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, people like this. But again, the bottom line here is they add very, very little new information about the life of Jesus other than what we encounter in the New Testament. Now, there's also the apocryphal Gospels, and you remember Kathy talked about the apocryphal Gospels several weeks ago, and beginning in the 2nd century, there were Christians who wrote a lot of largely fictitious accounts of Jesus's life and teachings based primarily on legends, or perhaps some of these accounts were based on oral traditions. But these so-called apocryphal Gospels, which again were written by Christians, but they were written primarily to entertain rather than to educate people. And so scholars dismiss virtually all of this material as being what we would call just kind of historical fiction or fanciful fiction with no real historical validity. So that's the apocryphal Gospels. Now, there was also, of course, accounts written of Jesus's life and works by non-Christian heretics, the Gnostic Gospels. And you might recall that Kathy addressed those as well. So in terms of extra biblical Christian sources, not much, to say the least, that adds to our understanding of the historical Christ. Now, what about, again, non-Christian sources? Well, that would include the Gnostic Gospels. And then also there's several other sources that are worthy of mentioning as well. Now, when it comes to these non-Christian sources, the question would be, is there any corroborating evidence by these extra biblical sources regarding the life of Jesus? And in a book written in 1978 by a man named Charles Templeton, this was merely a novel, and it's a novel about an archaeologist who makes the following claim about the historical Jesus. Quote, "The Christian church bases its claims mostly on the teachings of an obscure young Jew with messianic pretensions who, let's face it, did not make much of an impression in his lifetime. There isn't a single word about him in secular history, not a word. No mention of him by the Romans, not so much as a reference by Jews like Josephus, for instance." Okay, so that comes out of Charles Templeton's novel, Act of God, written in 1978. Now, that's absolutely erroneous. Factually, that's absolutely wrong. Several early sources, non-Christian sources, mention Jesus. Now, there are these scattered references, and it is a fact that there are only a few extra biblical sources concerning Jesus of the first and second century that have survived to the present. We don't know how many others were written. You know, most of what was written in the ancient world was lost. And if it wasn't lost for the first, few centuries, with the barbarian invasion of the Roman Empire, the sack of Rome, and so on, so much literature, libraries, and so on were devastated, burned, destroyed by these barbarian hordes. So a lot of ancient history has disappeared. So there may have been far more written about Jesus than just what we have. But let's take a look at what has survived to the present time. Now, again, unfortunately, these sources are few. Their comments about Jesus and about early Christianity are what I would call quite unexceptional, and they add virtually nothing to our understanding of Jesus or the early church. The Jewish historian Josephus briefly mentions Jesus. He also mentions John the Baptist and James. We'll talk about his reference to Jesus more in just a couple of minutes. What about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls provide absolutely no insight into Jesus or early Christianity. Those relate, the Dead Sea Scrolls relate to Old Testament writings and also to the writings of the sect that wrote and preserved those Dead Sea Scrolls, a sect called the Essenes, who lived around the area of Qumran on the coast of the Dead Sea. Now, what about the so-called Gnostic Gospels again? These are written in the mid to late 2nd century and beyond. As I said a while ago, the Gnostic Gospels shed very little light on Jesus and the historical origins of the Christian movement. In fact, they tend to misrepresent the historical Jesus. And although predominantly heretical, these Gnostic Gospels, like the apocryphal Gospels, do confirm at least some facts related to Jesus's life and ministry. For instance, in one Gnostic Gospel called the Gospel of Truth, quite a misnomer, but that's what it's called, the Gospel of Truth, it states, quote, "Jesus was patient in accepting sufferings since he knew that his death is life for many others. He was nailed to a tree." Well, that doesn't tell us anything that we didn't already know, and that's about all that it does say of any value at all regarding the historical Jesus. Now, also among Greco-Roman sources, there are some cryptic references in the writings of historians like Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and Epictetus And we'll talk about them again in just a few minutes here in a little bit more detail. But it's important to note that we need to keep in mind, again, to reemphasize the point, relatively few historical documents from the 1st century or the 2nd century have survived. So there might have been numerous references to Jesus in books other than the very, very few that have been preserved through over the last 2,000 years. And not until the late 2nd century did mainstream writers, Greco-Roman writers, begin to take much notice of Christianity. And why would these people, for the most part, kind of ignore Jesus and ignore the growth of Christianity? Well, see, keep in mind, these were usually social elites in Roman society, these historians. And prior to the late 2nd century, they didn't take much note of Christianity. This is understandable because prior to this, Christianity was not important enough to draw their attention. Say, they're writing about emperors and great conquering, generals, and writing a lot about Roman history and that sort of thing. And Christianity and what happened out in Judea among the Jews really holds little, if any, interest for mainstream Greco-Roman historians. Now, before we take a look at some of these sources in a little bit more depth, are there any questions or comments, anything that could use further explanation? Anything?
Jeffrey, that Charles Templeton,
Yes.
he wasn't Billy Graham's friend, was he?
Yes, he was.
Oh, he is.
Charles Templeton actually began his career in the ministry as an associate of Billy Graham. And in fact, of the two, many thought that Templeton was perhaps the more gifted of the two. Well, in 1950, I believe it was 1952, so in other words, they had been ministering together for 3 or 4 or 5 years. In 1952, Charles Templeton decided that he needed more in-depth education. And so he enrolled at Princeton Theological Seminary. Now, back in the early 1950s, Princeton still had some theological conservative faculty members. And even long after that, they had a great one in Bruce Metzger. But for the most part, Princeton Theological Seminary, which had really been the bastion of Presbyterianism and conservative Presbyterianism and Calvinism, beginning in the 1920s, Princeton began to move away from that tradition. And so by the early 1950s, when Templeton enrolled, Princeton already was fairly liberal. And of course, it's becoming, even more so over the last 50 years or so. But it was there at Princeton that Templeton began to encounter a lot of skepticism regarding Christianity in general and the Gospels in particular. And to make a long story short, he eventually renounced Christianity. And the last several decades of his life, he didn't even claim to be a Christian. On the other hand, Billy Graham, his faith continued to be bolstered throughout his life and his ministry. So it's very, very interesting backstory. But Templeton not only renounces his Christian faith, he becomes a rather fierce critic of Christianity. But that aside, the question is always, do these people have strong, compelling arguments? No, we don't look at their personal struggles and that sort of thing, but ultimately what matters is truth. And did he discover any new truth that would lead him to disavow Christianity? And the answer is absolutely not. In fact, my understanding is he died a very, very depressed individual.
Jeffrey,
Anything else on? Yes,
Jeffrey, yeah.
Bruce? Mhm.
I was looking while you were talking because I've seen this thing before, and I found on a J. Warner Wallace website, who is, of course, Cold Case Christianity. He's answering a sort of a short essay called "Is There Any Evidence for Jesus Outside the Bible?" I've seen this sort of thing before, and he has a long paragraph, probably 15 or 20 sentences, using only what he calls hostile witnesses. In other words, not people who were necessarily friendly, and just sets out in a narrative what we can know from about Jesus from those sources. And if you'd like, I could send a link to that, and you can circulate it if you want. Or
Yeah, please do. Yeah, I think that just be nothing but helpful. Yeah, thanks.
Jeffrey, I have a quick question.
Yes, Kathy?
On the Dead Sea Scrolls, is it just simply because the name Jesus is not found in those manuscripts, or is that why they say that there's no reference to him? Because we know, obviously, from Luke, that Jesus said, all of the Old Testament is about me.
Oh, yes. Well, what the Dead Sea Scrolls, the ones that we've discovered in the last 70 years or so, almost the entire Tanakh, almost the entire Old Testament was preserved in those Dead Sea Scrolls. Now that means that there might just be brief fragments of certain books of the Old Testament. The rest rotted away long ago. But in addition to that, the writings of that sect, that was a Jewish sect, kind of like Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, and others. These Essenes were kind of a we would probably characterize them as kind of a puritanical fundamentalist sect of Judaism. And they were very much cut off from mainstream Judaism. They were, by the way, wiped out. They were totally massacred in the Zealot revolt when the Roman armies moved into that area. And prior to that, they had hid their precious manuscripts in the caves around Qumran, on the northwest edge of the Dead Sea. So there is nothing about early Christianity, and certainly nothing about Jesus in the Dead Sea Scrolls. As far as we know, see, again, they were a self-segregated sect, and just a tiny sect of Jews, ultra-puritanical Jews, and perhaps they'd never even heard of Jesus Christ. That's how much cut off they were from mainstream Judaism and Jewish culture. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Jeffrey, the Dead Sea Scrolls do not include the book of Esther.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it does not, apparently, or maybe because the name of God is not in the book of Esther.
That's right. And as we talked about, or as Kathy talked about, actually, the book of Esther was always one of the most debated of the Old Testament books among Jews. And finally, and this comes in the 2nd century AD, finally, there was kind of a consensus that, yes, the book of Esther belongs in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament scriptures, but it had been debated for generations.
Jeffrey,
yes,
we've gone off on a Dead Sea Scroll tangent here. One of the things that it did do was really a kind of a justification of the copying and transmission process, because at the time the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1946, the oldest manuscripts of the Torah came from about 1100, right? And all the skeptics said, well, if you ever had something from back at the turn of the century and so forth and so on, you'd find it's all very different and so forth and so on. And although they only found Jewish manuscripts, they discovered an absolutely incredible faithfulness to in the manuscripts that they had as of 1100, as
yes.
there were back in the year 0, if you will, at the turn of the millennium.
Yes.
And it was just incomprehensible that this could have been done. And of course, that means if they could do it for the Jewish scriptures, why couldn't it have been done, for the Christian scriptures? And just adds a I don't know what to write, a supporting epistemic sort of point, to this whole issue.
Yeah, very good point. I'm glad you raised that. That prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, our oldest Hebrew manuscripts dated back to about the year 1000 or so. And so these Dead Sea Scrolls included Old Testament manuscripts, uh, some which were produced probably early in the 1st century AD, others probably in 1 or 2 centuries before Christ. And as Bruce indicated, what they do is to verify the precision with which Jewish scholars translated their historic scriptures. And so comparing the manuscripts from the year 1000 to those in the 1st century, we find just, again, incredible correlation there. Remember, these Jewish scholars would consider these manuscripts to be the Word of God. And so they were just absolutely just very, very scrupulous in translating it as perfectly as possible. And if, according to tradition, if a scribe made a mistake near the bottom of a page in the manuscript, the whole thing would be thrown out and he would start all over again. That's how meticulous they were. Okay, now let's take a look here at, again, the primary non-Christian sources, what they tell us about the historical Jesus. Let's start with Josephus. Now, Josephus was a highly educated Jewish scholar. He was also a statesman in the 1st century, and was someone who had participated in the Zealot revolt and was taken back to Rome by the Roman armies. And he wrote an extensive history of the Jews while back in Rome in the 70s, after the Zealot revolt had ended. And he writes some other works as well. But what we're going to be citing is his work entitled Antiquities, or Antiquities of the Jews. So in one passage, Josephus writes of the martyrdom of James the Just. And it's very interesting. I won't take time to read through it with you, but James the Just, as I said, was martyred in the year 62. He was murdered there in Jerusalem. And by the way, the Zealot revolt broke out just a few years after that. Now, this James the Just was regarded as the premier apostle among Jewish Christians there in Jerusalem. And so he has a very, very productive ministry for about 30 years, from the time of the resurrection and Pentecost up to his martyrdom in the year 62. But in his writings, Josephus calls James, quote, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. Now, you notice that Josephus says that James is the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. Josephus doesn't say that Jesus was the Christ. He's merely saying that some people believed that Jesus was the Christ. Now, in another passage of very questionable authenticity, he refers once again to Jesus. Now, this passage is oftentimes referred to as the Testimonium Flavianum, in other words, the testimony of Flavius Josephus. And this is probably the one that, if you're familiar with Josephus's writings, you probably have heard about this, read it in the past. Now, I'm going to read it verbatim as I reproduced it in your outline notes. And you'll notice as we're going along here, certain passages are italicized. So you might pay attention to that in particular. So this is what is preserved of what Josephus writes about Jesus Christ. At this time, there appeared Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one should call him a man. For he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. he was the Messiah. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so, for he appeared to them on the third day, living again, just as the divine prophets had spoken of these and countless other wondrous things about him. And up until this very day, up until the end of the first century, basically, up until this very day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out. Wow, that is a really powerful testimony. You see there that he questions whether Jesus was merely a man. You see that he refers to Jesus as the Messiah. And furthermore, he writes that Jesus appeared to his followers on the third day. He had come back to life, and just as the prophets had foretold. Now, all of what I just said is highly questionable for the obvious reason. If Josephus actually believed what I just read, Josephus would have been a Christian, but he's not a Christian. He's a Jew, and he never claims to be a Christian. Nobody's ever confused him with the Christian faith. So what in the world's going on here? Well, in all likelihood, he did write about Jesus. In all likelihood, his comments were later redacted, probably by a Christian editor who thought they weren't sufficient. And so this Christian editor bolstered the case for the messianic and divinity of Jesus Christ. So that is a very likely solution. Again, otherwise, Josephus would have been a follower of Jesus. He would have been a Christian, but he was not. But it's more interesting and more problematic than even that. Now, in the late 1800s, one of the great church historians in America was a Lutheran historian by the name of Philip Schaff. And Philip Schaff looks at this statement that's recorded by Josephus and so on. And he also looked at earlier or all the ancient copies of Josephus's work that we have. And he notices that all of them include that disputed passage, such as he was the Messiah and so on. And Philip Schaff even noted that early Slavonic or even Slavic or Russian, even Russian and Arabic language versions included those comments about Jesus being the Messiah and so on. So nobody can really explain how a single Christian editor could have altered all of these widely distributed versions of Josephus's work. Now, Origen, a great Christian scholar in the early 200s, so this is the early 3rd century, Origen questioned why Josephus would have rejected Jesus as the Messiah, while at the same time showing such respect for Jesus's brother, James. Now, Origen's comment proves that Josephus's original writings contained references to Jesus long before, again, any Christian editor could have manufactured this questionable passage that I read a while ago. But of course, this does not shed light on exactly what Josephus wrote about Jesus. So virtually nobody believes that Josephus did not write anything about Jesus. What's curious is what we have preserved here, and why would a non-Christian write this about Jesus? Sure, a non-Christian like Josephus, a pious Jew, could have written a lot about Jesus being a good man, a great rabbi, and so on, who had a very devout following. But Josephus goes well beyond that, see? And so it's an open question. Now, what's particularly important for our purposes is because it is a questionable quote, we would want to be ultra cautious using that as if it were some kind of strong, definitive affirmation, of Josephus believing in Jesus the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So it's an interesting scholarly question, intellectual question, and beyond that, there's not a whole lot we can say about that that very famous passage about Jesus. Now let's look at the next one in your notes there, which is the Babylonian Talmud. Now, perhaps you've heard of the Talmuds. The Talmuds are actually commentaries on the Torah, on the Jewish law. And the Babylonian Talmud, and by the way, these Talmuds were compiled from about roughly the year 100 BC, 100 years before Christ, and they weren't really finished until nearly 500 AD. So the Talmuds are compiled by Jewish scholars over a period of about 600 years. And there's various Talmuds, but we're referring to one in particular called the Babylonian Talmud. Now, this is one that again was written and edited and redacted and so on over a period of a number of years. And the Babylonian Talmud barely even mentions Jesus. But keep in mind that it also hardly mentions any individual from the time of the Babylonian captivity, which would have been almost 600 years BC, up to the time of the Zealot revolt. So not only is Jesus never mentioned or not only is Jesus hardly mentioned in the Talmuds don't even mention great Jewish scholars like Hillel or Gamaliel. They also don't even mention the great Jewish patriotic hero Judas Maccabeus. So the fact that it says very little about Jesus, well, it says very little about most anybody in Jewish history. Furthermore, the references to Jesus are not reliable, since our earliest text dates back to the 5th or 6th centuries AD, so many centuries after Christ. Also, there's an obvious bias in these texts because the authors are decidedly hostile toward Jesus and Christianity. Now, one text suggests that Jesus, who it calls Ben Pandera, in other words, the son of Pandera, Jesus was the illegitimate child of an illicit relationship between his mother and a Roman soldier. You've probably heard that, myth before, that legend before. And so we of course would discount that totally, except for that allegation does tend to verify the Christian tradition regarding the manner of Jesus's conception and his birth as being quite unusual or controversial. Okay. Other than that, of course, it's worthless. It's a totally worthless statement. Now, one other text in the Babylonian Talmud declares that Yeshua, Jesus, had 5 disciples, and it names 5 people. One of these sounds like Matthew, but the others are just, names like Nakai, Netzer, Buni, Toda, and these don't really seem to correlate in any way to any of Jesus's real disciples. Like I said, Mattai is probably Matthew, maybe Toda, perhaps, maybe Thaddeus, I'm sorry. But anyway, apparently the rabbis who wrote the Talmud were only aware of the names of a few of Jesus's followers. And even at that, they got them wrong. Okay. Now, another text states that Jesus, Yeshua, was hanged on Passover after a trial determined that he should be executed as a, quote, sorcerer, someone who perhaps works miracles. and that this Yeshua had led people astray into apostasy. Well, apostasy from Judaism. So Yeshua is hanged on Passover after a trial determines that he should be executed as a sorcerer, a person who had led the people astray into apostasy. And see, again, by implication, it does confirm that Jesus had an active teaching ministry. It calls him a sorcerer, and he had led people astray. And it also implies or hints that perhaps Jesus worked miracles. He was a, quote, sorcerer, according to this text. All right, so the Babylonian Talmud, there's not a whole lot there of value, to say the least. In fact, nothing of value, frankly. Now, let's look at a very prominent Roman historian, Cornelius Tacitus. And Tacitus's career spans the last half of the 1st century and into the 2nd century. And Tacitus, like a lot of these elite Romans, was very contemptuous of Jews and contemptuous of Jewish religion and Jewish culture and anything that would have emerged from Judaism, like, for instance, Christianity. And so he writes about Nero's persecution of Christians in the year 64 AD. And again, I've provided here in your notes a shortened version of that. You can go online and read the full extended. But basically, this is what Tacitus says about Nero's persecution of the Jews, which is very well attested historically. Therefore, now remember, Nero, by this time in his reign, these are the year 64. He's gonna die in 67, and so by this point in his reign, the man is absolutely berserk, and he's very much hated and detested by most Romans. He's totally out of control. He can't govern himself, and he certainly can't govern the empire. Therefore, and by the way, this is right after the famous fire broke out in Rome that destroyed about 1/3 of the entire historic city. And so we pick up at that point. Now Nero is trying to deflect blame from himself. Many Romans thought that he had set the city on fire, or his agents had set the city on fire, because he had been talking about clearing out a large section and building a new golden palace. And so when that section, as well as others, burn, there are rumors that it was Nero who actually or his agents who actually set the fire. So therefore, to scotch the rumor of his own guilt, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed, hated for their vices, whom the crowd called Christians. Now, Christus, from whom they had gotten their name, had been executed by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate when Tiberius was emperor. And a deadly superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of that evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from all parts of the world meet and become popular. And so basically, Tacitus goes on to describe these heinous, sadistic tortures that Nero inflicts upon the Christians of Rome. We don't know if scores of Christians were tortured, hung up, crucified, burned at the stake, or if it were hundreds, or perhaps even more than hundreds. But we do know that it was quite a spectacle. And in fact, Nero would host elaborate garden parties in his palace complex, and he would hang up Christians on poles, crosses, I assume, and set them on fire to serve as torchlights for his garden parties. Okay. So again, there's more that Tacitus writes about that account. I didn't want to reproduce the entire account, but you can look it up online, or if you have books that are relevant to it. Now, another very famous Roman historian is Gaius Suetonius. And Suetonius comes along about a generation or so, or at least several decades after Tacitus. And he's also, like Tacitus, a very renowned historian. And Suetonius includes two very brief references to Christians in his book entitled The Lives of the 12 Caesars. And in that book, he notes that the Emperor Claudius, Claudius served from, let's see, from 14 to 30, 37 to 40. Claudius reigns from about 43 to 54 AD. I think I've got the dates about right. But anyway, Suetonius is referring to the reign here of Claudius. And he says that during the reign of Claudius in the year 49 AD, all the Jews were expelled from Rome for rioting at the instigation of Christus. Historians believe that that's a reference to Christus, to Christ. Now, apparently, what Suetonius is implying there is that Jews and Christians were probably quarreling in the synagogues in Rome over the issue of Christ, and was Christ truly the Messiah or not? Now, the Romans weren't interested in this kind of a theological dispute among Jews and a religion that had come out of Judaism. So Claudius, having no interest in the theology at stake, just orders all the Jews, and presumably most of the Christians too, out of the city. And again, this is attested to in other ancient secular sources. Okay. Also, in writing about Nero's reign, Suetonius notes the persecution of the Christians. And he says that, quote, the Christians were punished under Nero, a sect that professes a new and mischievous superstition. Now, why would he call the Christians mischievous? Well, probably because they refused to swear allegiance to the emperor.
I doubt you can hear me, Jeffrey, but you're frozen. Audio and video. Yeah.
Yeah, he just ended this into.
Well, I have a question while he's frozen. What do the Jews believe about Jesus now, currently? I mean, I know they believe that he existed.
Good question, Jenny. Maybe Kathy will answer that for us.
Well, I think I guess the safest answer is that they do not believe that he is the Messiah. They don't view him in any way as being their Messiah, and they're still looking for their Messiah.
Yeah.
But I think sadly, so much of Judaism now is just a cultural type, observance, that they're not even really religious in their own right. I mean, they don't have a way for atoning sin. They use a works-based theology to atone for their sin now, because there is no temple whereby they can sacrifice. And the genealogies and all of that were destroyed in 70 AD. They were kept in the temple, so there's no way they can connect to what tribe they're in and all of that. So they're really a sheep without a shepherd at this point, I believe.
But Kathy, I will say there is a pretty significant movement of what's called Messianic Judaism,
Right.
where they are sort of a quasi, almost Christian, or some of them anyway. And we have a lot of Jewish friends here in East Cobb, and we've had discussions and dinners and been to seders and things like that. And a lot of them are very intrigued by our beliefs about Jesus and so forth. So I think there's hope I think everybody believes there's hope for Jews ultimately.
Like, yeah, well, I think Romans would tell us that for sure. But isn't it interesting in the Seder how, as a Christian, you see so clearly how even that observance points to Christ, but yet for a time anyway, their eyes are darkened. So.
I was going to suggest to Jenny.
Well, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry.
No, I was just real quick. I was going to suggest to Jenny that if you can find a Messianic synagogue or meet a Messianic Jew, that's a great place to start to ask what their non-believing brothers believe about Jesus.
Yes. Now, I believe there is a Messianic Jewish church congregation is it Roswell?
Yeah.
It's up on Shallowford.
Yeah, right.
Between Johnson Ferry and Maine.
I've never visited there, but I suspect that probably some of you all have.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
I think it's called Temple Bethel.
Well, I think
Yes,
that's right.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I had finished that comment regarding Suetonius and this idea that Christians were mischievous people. Now, we know from later historical sources that Christians are persecuted for their refusal to swear allegiance to Caesar as Lord. They would respond, no, Jesus is Lord. And and I should say that also Jews were suspect. I mean, true religious Jews were suspect among the Romans for the same reasons that Jews refused to swear absolute allegiance to the state and to Caesar, because true Jews believed that their highest calling, of course, and fidelity was to Yahweh, was to God, and Christians would believe the same thing, of course. And I think the last point I made before my computer decided to close down momentarily was that look, the times, they are a-changing here in America, and we see the growth of big state government that wants to control virtually every aspect of our lives. Now, my wife Dolly is part of a book club. Millie is in that book club as well, and several others. They were reading last month and discussing Brave New World. And I remember Dolly remarking one night as we were sitting around reading and she was finishing up Brave New World, she turns to me and says, I think I'm right. I think I'm reading about the Biden administration here. We best beware and we best be prepared, because we're on uncharted territory in American history. We have never had such pathetic leadership in all of our history. And so a time of great testing may very well be coming, and we better be prepared to suffer whatever is necessary for the cause of Christ. As I've said before, American Christians have been the most privileged, the most prosperous, and the most free Christians in all of Christian history. There's no assurance that that's going to continue. And yes, there will still be churches, government-sanctioned churches, that continue to function, just as is the case in communist China today. But for true Christians, it may come a time of very, very intense testing of our faith and our resolve. So anyway, let's continue on here in our study with the outline. Now, another interesting piece of writing from the early 2nd century that relates to Christians and Jesus is correspondence between Pliny the Younger, who was the governor of a portion of Turkey with the emperor at the time, Trajan. And in this case, Pliny the Younger, the procurator, the governor of this portion of Turkey, of Asia Minor, is seeking advice as far as how to deal with the Christians in his territory. And this is what he says. This is my preface basically. At the outset of his governorship, Pliny had ordered the execution of several Christians who refused to renounce their faith. But soon he realizes that there are so many of these people in his province that he decides to apply to the emperor for a ruling. He doesn't want to commit a mass, slaughter of so many people. So this is a portion of what he writes to the Emperor Trajan. Quote, I have never been present at trials of Christians. I've never seen Christians interrogated before. Consequently, I do not know the precedents regarding the question of punishment or the nature of the inquiry. So far this has been my procedure when people were charged before me with being Christians. Now, I have asked the accused themselves if they were in fact Christians. Now, if they say yes, I asked them a second and a third time, warning them of the penalty. If they persisted, I ordered them to be led off to execution, for I had no doubt that stubbornness and unyielding obstinacy, at any rate, deserved to be punished. So he doesn't mind if they lie and say, oh no, used to be a Christian, I'm not now. If they continue to uphold that they are in fact Christians, these people need to be punished, executed for obstinacy, for being stubborn, if nothing else. This Pliny is a real deep thinker, as you can tell here. Now, he goes on to say, they maintain that their fault or their error amounted to nothing more than this, that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before sunrise, Sundays, and reciting an antiphonal hymn to Christ as God. And they also binded themselves with an oath not to commit any crime, but to abstain from all acts of theft, robbery, adultery, from breaches of faith, from denying a trust when called upon to honor it. So I thought it all the more necessary to inquire into the real truth of the matter. And so I subjected to torture 2 female slaves who were called deacons. So we see that even at this early time in Christian history, you have deacons who are females. And he tortures them, orders them to be tortured. But I found nothing more than a perverse superstition which went beyond all boundaries. So he tortures these deaconesses, and the only thing that they can get out of these women is that they hold to some perverse superstition that is just incredible. Undoubtedly a reference to God becoming human, suffering and dying for our sins, and coming back to life again. Pliny continues, therefore I deferred further inquiry in order to apply to you, to the emperor, for a ruling. The case seemed to me to be a proper one for consideration because of the number of those who are accused. For many of every age, every class, and of both sexes are being accused. So young people, old people, males, females, they're all being accused of being Christians. Nor has this contagious superstition spread throughout the cities only, but also in our villages and countryside. So this new sect, Christianity, is alive and flourishing not only in the cities of northwestern Turkey, Asia Minor, but also in the countryside and villages as well. All right, so he writes this to Trajan. Now, fortunately, we have Trajan's response, which has been preserved through the centuries. And so Trajan basically tells Pliny, ignore these people. They really don't pose any real threat. If, however, they are accused of being Christians, and if they refuse to recant, they should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law for being obstinate, if nothing else. In other words, they've been warned, you cannot follow this religion. And if they continue to say that they will, then they need to be punished for being obstinate, stubborn people. Again, Trajan obviously is a deep thinker too. He goes on to say, you have followed the correct procedure in deciding the cases of those who have been charged before you as Christians. Now, these people must not be ferreted out. In other words, what Trajan is saying is, look, this is not a priority. Don't send, your agents, your troops all throughout the area trying to find every Christian possible. They're not that important. So they must not be ferreted out, but if they are charged and convicted, if they refuse to recant their Christian faith, they must be punished. Okay. So that's the correspondence between Pliny the Younger and the Emperor Trajan. And again, there's more. I had kind of edited and shortened that correspondence. Now, here's an interesting work from Lucian of Samosata. This is dated to about the year 160 AD. And this Lucian of Samosata is a trained lawyer. He's a very popular social satirist of his day, and he's also a traveling lecturer. So he's kind of a celebrity. He's a lawyer and a celebrity. And in particular, he likes to expose religious frauds and cults. Now, in a satire of a Cynic philosopher by the name of Proteus Peregrinus, Lucian includes a description of the Christians of Palestine, among whom this Proteus Peregrinus had lived for a while. And this is what Lucian writes, quote, Peregrinus learned the wonderful doctrine of the Christians by conversing with their priests and scribes near Palestine. They spoke of Christ as a God and took him to be a lawgiver and honored him with the title of Master or Lord. They still worship that great man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced into the world this new cult, this new religion. Moreover, their first lawgiver has taught them that they are all brethren. When once they turned and renounced the gods of the Greeks, the pagan gods, and worshiped that master of theirs who was crucified and engaged to live according to his laws. So again, that doesn't tell us a great deal, but again, it's a kind of an interesting testimony to, again, the integrity of the Christians that Peregrinus had encountered in Judea. And again, this is about the year 160. Now, here's a letter in the late first century again. This goes back to the late first century. I'm sorry, a little bit before that. The letter of Mara Bar-Serapion, I'm sorry. And Mara Bar-Serapion is a Syrian, and he writes a letter from prison in which he exhorts his son, Serapion, to follow the example of various esteemed teachers of the past. And this is what he writes, quote, what advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Their great philosopher and secular prophet, perhaps, Socrates. What advantage did the Athenians get when they unjustly executed Socrates? Famine and plague came upon them as judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras, another ancient philosopher who was held in very high esteem by some? In a moment, their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. He's talking about the Zealot revolt, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and so on. He says, God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samians were overwhelmed by the sea. And the Jews, ruined and driven from their land, lived in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not really die. He lived on in the statue of Hera. In other words, his memory continues on. Nor did the wise king really die. he lived on in the teachings which he had given. So again, what does this tell us about early Christianity and Jesus? Well, not a whole lot, but it is one of the few references from antiquity that have survived. Now, there's numerous accounts related to the darkness during the time of the crucifixion. And so you can scan those, and if you want to look it up online or whatever, you can get far more information on those references to the darkness during the crucifixion. Now let's kind of conclude here with a couple of lingering questions. And one would be this: if Jesus was so important, why didn't more people write about him? Also, one would assume that there should be all kinds of records related to his teachings and activities, both from Jewish and Roman sources. We've seen that there's a few, very few, but there certainly are not many. And so, given the lack of references to Jesus, should that create doubt as to Jesus's existence? Now, here's an answer that I would provide, and we can discuss this if you'd like. First of all, several Roman historians and chroniclers do mention Jesus, if even briefly. Some even mention Christians in their writings near the end of the 1st century and into the 2nd century. But the question would arise, see, where are the Roman records of Jesus's life and trial? For instance, where are the court records of his interrogation before Pilate? See, what did Pontius Pilate have to say about the trial? As far as we know, Roman governors, procurators were supposed to keep detailed accounts of these kind of interrogations and decisions and so on. So why have we none? What happened to the so-called Acts of Pontius Pilate? Now, there were some apocryphal Christian writings in the 2nd and 3rd century that alluded to the Acts of Pontius Pilate, but they've never survived if they existed at all. But keep in mind again that the vast majority of writings from the 1st century are lost. And so perhaps Pontius Pilate did write something about his interrogation of Jesus and Jesus' crucifixion and so on, but we really do not know, and we really cannot say. All we can say is that that was a common procedure, but again, we have very few of those kind of accounts that have survived to the present day. Now, again, as it relates to Jesus, why is none of this recorded in Roman writings? We have Roman chroniclers, keep in mind, who are part of the social elite. And frankly, these people don't find Jesus or Christianity to be very important. See, these are elite scholars. Many of them live in Rome itself, or, Alexandria, Egypt, or Athens, places like that. And for them, they have no respect for Jewish culture and civilization. And for many of them, Christianity is just kind of a sect of Judaism. So they really have no interest, frankly. Now, another thing to consider, of course, is that these early Roman historians and chroniclers had absolutely no idea that Jesus Christ would become the founder of what would eventually become the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now that takes place, several centuries later. It wasn't until the year 379 or 380 under the Emperor Theodosius that Christianity finally was declared the official religion of the Roman Empire, replacing Greco-Roman paganism. So in the first several centuries, Christianity is generally regarded by the elite to be just, a strange cult and not all that interesting or important. Now, again, Romans have very little respect for Jews, and they are disinterested in Jewish political or theological disputes. And keep in mind that in the first century, preceding Jesus, and then actually to some extent after Jesus's ministry as well, there were several Jewish so-called messiahs, pretend messiahs, who emerged in the first century, but they were quickly snuffed out and forgotten. They were executed and nobody, long forgotten. And so in the minds of a lot of elite Romans, Greeks and Romans, this sect of Christians was no different than the groups that had followed some of these messianic pretenders who came along periodically in the first century. Also, like most non-Christian historians and biographers today, ancient writers had very little interest in Jesus except to dismiss him as a mostly legendary figure. Again, we've talked about how that's common today as well. And so furthermore, they were highly offended by the claims of Christian exclusivity. In other words, that Christianity was the only true religion, as is, again, the case today as well. And so those are all plausible explanations or partial explanations as to why there is such a dearth of information from secular non-biblical sources on the historical Jesus. But one more thought here on why didn't more Jews in particular write about Jesus? Thousands of people had heard Jesus preach and teach. Why did none of them, other than the gospel writers, record Jesus's teachings and miracles? Well, for one thing, consider that Judea and Galilee were a predominantly oral culture. But in fact, as Luke tells us, many prior to the time he wrote his gospel, many had already written things about Jesus. But his intention was to write what he calls an orderly account, or perhaps he means a systematic, thoroughly researched, historically accurate account of Jesus. So in fact, people were writing about Jesus, but apparently those anecdotal writings were superseded by the gospel accounts, and they were quickly forgotten, and so on. Also, of course, again, just to reiterate, the vast majority of writings from the first century never survived. Now, what about Jewish writers like Philo of Alexandria, one of the great authors of the first century? Why does he not mention Jesus? Well, he lives in Alexandria, Egypt. And you see the dates of his life, 20 BC to 50 AD, which means that he died only about 20 years after Jesus's ministry. He lives in Alexandria, Egypt. He's not a historian. And so it's actually possible that perhaps he never even had heard of Jesus Christ. But on the other hand, Josephus, who is a historian, does mention Jesus. Okay. So with that, we're close to the expiration time. And so let me just open it up for a few minutes here. I understand if you need to check out in the next few minutes here, but if you want to stay on for several more minutes, we can talk about some of the matters that have come up this evening. And then beginning next Wednesday night, by the way, we'll transition into part 2 of our study, which will cover much more rapidly than part 1. And this begins with chapter 6. The real Jesus and the Gospels. And with that, we'll begin constructing a very methodical apologetic as to why the gospel accounts of the life of Christ are to be taken as serious biography, serious history as well.